Welcome to this special program on the Integrated National Financing Framework, the INFF, a conversation which we're hosting from both Abuja and Lagos studios. I'm Maokwe Ogun Yusuf. On the 1st of January 2016, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs of the United Nations, were launched following the modest gains recorded by the Millennium Development Goals. Countries and nations all over the world pledged to end poverty and hunger by the year 2030 and also to invest in quality education and improved living standards for all, amongst many other lofty commitments. Doing so in an environmentally friendly manner, all by the year 2030. Nigeria committed itself even more intently to a number of the goals, about 8 of them. But economic shocks caused by dwindling revenues from its mainstay of crude oil, a global pandemic caused by the coronavirus, and more recently, a war between Russia and Ukraine has meant that not only her, but a number of other countries are falling behind on achieving these magnificent goals by the set target date. The United Nations wasn't going to sit idly by and do nothing. Its development arm, the UN Development Program, the UNDP, in conjunction with many noble partners whom I'll be mentioning soon, came together to develop these set of tools known as the Integrated National Financing Framework. And it's the reason we're gathered today to discuss these tools, bring them to your attention, and see how everyone can play a role in ensuring that the Sustainable Development Goals are possible by the year 2030. This dialogue has been brought to you and supported by the European Union, the Office of the Senior Special Advisor to the President on SDG, the UNDP in partnership with yours truly, Channels Television. As I said earlier, it's a conversation, and so I have a full studio with me filled with eminent panelists and a distinguished audience in both Lagos and Abuja. And so on my panel today, I'm happy to welcome in our Abuja studios, Mohamed Yaya. Welcome, it's good to see you again. He is the resident representative of the United Nations Development Program. We also have with us Ms. Cecile Tassin-Pelzer, who is the European Union delegation to Nigeria and ECOWAS. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We also have Dr. Bala Yusuf Yunisa, who is the Senior Technical Advisor, Office of the Senior Special Advisor to the President on SDGs. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Mrs. Nabila Aguele, who is a Special Advisor to the Honorable Minister, Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning. Welcome. And certainly, Mr. Femi Edgar, you are last but certainly not least.
Definitely.
I certainly know that we have other panelists who will be joining us soon. He's the Head Exchange of Information Division, Tax Policy and Advisory at the Federal Inland Revenue Service. You're welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
We also have a list of panelists joining us in our Lagos studios. In our Lagos studios, we have Mr. Bolaji Balogun, who is the co-chair of the PSAG, that's a Private Sector Advisory Group. Mr. Balogun, if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Good morning and welcome to you.
Loud and clear. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
Mr. Jude Onyeka Chiemeka is the Divisional Head of Capital Markets, NGX. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, and I hope you can hear me. We're delighted to be here.
Yes, loud and clear. I can hear you. And I also believe that much later we'll be joined by Mr. Etamor Glover, who is a project lead, Impact Investment Foundation.
She's right here.
I'm right here.
Oh,
and
she is there. Well, my apologies. Welcome once again, Etamor Glover, who is the project lead, Impact Investment Foundation.
Thank you, Mwakwe. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
A warm welcome to our distinguished audience, both here in Abuja and indeed wherever you are. In addition to being broadcast on our TV platforms, this program is also streaming on all our digital platforms, and your contributions will be highly welcome through the social media handles, which we'll be putting on your screens shortly. Well, let's get to the conversation, and I'm going to be asking the resident representative of the UNDP, Mr. Mohamed Yahya, what we're talking about today. We're talking about the Integrated National Financing Framework, and I'm sure our viewers have been wondering, what is this about, INFF? In 2015, Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and more recently, the 2019 Financing for Development Forum, several countries committed to putting the INFF in place. So can you tell us what it is really about?
First, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to join all of my colleagues here. We've been working very closely on the issue of the INFF. So the INFF essentially is, once the SDGs were passed, there was a recognition early on we needed to think about how to finance the Sustainable Development Goals. And each country, through the work was initially started at Addis Ababa, you mentioned, committed to the INFF process. And Nigeria in the last year or so has been lead in terms of looking into where Nigeria's development financing will come from. So what it really means, when a country has a development ambition, and the SDGs are the ambition in this country, how and where are we going to get the resources or the monies to be able to pay for that development ambition? So what the INFF has been doing is to actually interrogate that. It looks at the public sector, what needs to be done in the public sector in Nigeria, and issues of taxation and other things are looked at. And then it looks in the private sector. What does the private sector need to do to be able to create more jobs, more opportunity, more revenue, so that Nigeria's development ambition is achieved? But it goes beyond that. It also looked at the issue around remittance. What do we need to do to ensure that the country's, Nigeria has a huge remittance base? What needs to be done to ensure that remittance are used for the country's development? And also FDI. Nigeria today has a very low FDI, foreign direct investment. What can the country do to ensure that it attracts more foreign direct investments so that more jobs and more revenues are created? So this is what the INFF is. It's a comprehensive framework for financing Nigeria's development ambitions.
Indeed, and I know that, since you're representing the Ministry of Finance here, we're talking finance, and those are the questions that are going to be coming to you. So can you tell us what the relevance of the INFF is for Nigeria?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having us, and very much thanks to our partners, UNDP and the EU and OSAP, for convening this gathering. So as the resident representative has expressed, the INFF is really around developing a sustainable and much needed financing plan to achieve the SDGs in line with our National Development Plan. We signed on to the INFF in December 2019, so right before the COVID pandemic, but immediately recognized through the leadership of the Honourable Minister that this was an opportune time, given that our already fiscally tight environment was also constrained because of COVID, because of the economic shocks, and of course you've also mentioned the subsequent war and other global shocks. So for us, the idea is to leverage this opportunity, working with a group of multiple stakeholders, including development partners, private sectors at the table, the Office of the Senior Assistant to the President on the SDGs are also at the table, states are also at the table, and to really scrutinize our financing sources and say, let us have a plan that comprises a financing strategy, a revenue strategy, as well as a medium-term expenditure framework that really maps out how we will achieve the financing, what are the revenue sources, what are areas of untapped potential, and how do we go about doing that within the required time. The other thing I wanted to say is that this is very much in line with our long-standing commitment to achieving the SDGs. Long before the INFF and before COVID, we were already integrating the SDGs into our national development plans, including the Economic Recovery and Sustainable Development Plan, as well as the National Poverty Reduction Plan, and then much later on the Economic Sustainability Plan, which was the fiscal stimulus plan put in place to address the COVID pandemic.
So I'm asking myself, why is this really important? Because we know that, yes, while we have all of these plans, one of the ways which Nigeria achieves this is through its budget. We've been told we do not exactly have a national budget, that a national budget will be a budget that comprises the federal government and also takes into account that of the states. But at least we have a federal government budget. We know that the federal government has a huge chunk of whatever comes to the federation account, and as such makes its budget from there. why would you say that the INFF is really important, given that if we have already started integrating this SDGs into our budget, why do we need the INFF to, you know, still help us out here?
No, that's an excellent question. So even with the already well-established system and infrastructure to achieve the SDGs and mainstream it to the state level, what's unique about the INFF is that for the first time you have a structure both at the political level and also at the technical level of stakeholders. So all of these stakeholders who typically are working in their own way towards achieving the SDGs, the development partners, the governments, the federal and state government, coming together in a coordinated way, doing an assessment that is time-bound, right? So even though we'd been working diligently toward the SDGs, so much changed after the COVID pandemic. So for us, it was quite fortuitous timing that we undertook the process while also grappling with the implications of COVID and now with the implications of the war in Ukraine. So the idea is to say, what have we been doing? What has worked? Where are there opportunities for revenue, for tapping into remittances, for attracting foreign direct investments? And how do we ensure that all stakeholders are at the table? So we have the private sector represented through PSAG. We have development partners at the table, including UNDP, the EU, the World Bank, Africa Development Bank, and others. We also have OSAP serving as the secretariat, so really tapping into the existing infrastructure.
Would you say that our priorities changed somewhat after these shocks? I mean, especially COVID and now the Russia-Ukraine war. Did our priorities change from, you know, the SDGs which we had, you know, started incorporated into our budget before that time?
So this is a great question. I would say the priorities didn't change. We're still implementing the INFF in line with our national development plans and also with the most recently launched medium-term development plan. And in fact, the medium-term expenditure framework and the revenue strategy for the INFF draw directly from the MTEF and the revenue strategy that is implemented through the Budget Office and the Ministry. So it's not that our priorities changed. It's just that now in Nigeria and the rest of the world, there's a sense of urgency. There's a sense of saying we really need to not only identify these potential sources of revenue, both domestically and internationally, but come together as stakeholders in a coordinated, integrated way to achieve that. And as has been said, to see where there's been untapped potential, interrogate the bottlenecks, and then put in place an implementation process that allows all stakeholders to work together towards achieving it.
Well, let me come back to you, Hamadiya. We do know, I mean, as Mrs. Agwele did mention, that Nigerians signed up before COVID. But I think perhaps someone was saying it was in the year of COVID, in the year 2020. What would you say that Nigeria has been able to achieve since this program was launched?
As pointed by Nabila, I think Nigeria is probably the most advanced, the first country to complete the INFF process, the first stage of the process. And she mentioned the revenue strategy, the financing strategy, what we call DFA, the development financing assessment. So all that put together and the roadmap positions Nigeria as probably the first country that will be able to immediately start the process of generating, or at least implementing, both of the private sector and the government sector. It's important the viewers understand it's not only a government exercise. The increasing private sector opportunities and getting the revenue is also extremely important. And foreign direct investment is another one. So Nigeria is ready. The next stage is the implementation. And that is where I think all of us, our partners from the European Union, our partners from the World Bank and others, and the IMF will be supporting the implementation. So the strategies are in place. It's time for action.
Well, this certainly concerns, when we talk about the SDGs, this certainly concerns you, Dr. Yusuf Yunusa. Let me ask you, what is the broad content of the financing strategy?
Thank you very much for having us. I recall that world leaders adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in September 2015. And Nigeria also, as part of that commitment, established the Office of the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Sustainable Development Goals to provide horizontal and vertical intergovernmental planning and coordination, resource mobilization and management, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting and then representation and partnership building. So let me just give a context. The SDGs, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, are better when they are integrated into our national and subnational development planning process. And it is within that context, and as a demonstration of Nigeria's commitment to the SDGs, that we began the process of drafting or designing the Integrated National Financing Framework. And at the core of the INFF framework is actually the Integrated National Financing Strategy. And I give an example. The entire budget of the Federation in 2022 is about 27 trillion naira. The federal component is about 17.1 trillion naira, while the sub-36 states combine about 10 trillion naira. That is about $60 billion today. So this is about the size of the public sector in relation to an economy with a GDP of approximately $407 billion. So there is need to shift from funding sustainable development to financing sustainable development, because funding is hardly adequate and sustainable, but financing is sustainable. So to achieve the SDGs, we need to shift from funding sustainable development to financing sustainable development. That means tapping, the private capital and then bringing it into financing sustainable development. And it is a recognition of that the Integrated National Financing Strategy mapped out the domestic public sources and domestic private sources, as well as international public sources and international private sources for financing Nigeria's development. The 2021 to 2025 New National Development Plan estimates an investment of approximately 350 trillion naira over the plan period. And there was this recognition that almost 58% of that will come from outside the public sector. And therefore, at the heart of the Integrated National Financing Strategy is all the sources of financing development, including strengthening our domestic resource mobilization in support of the achievement of the SDGs in Nigeria.
It's interesting that you make a distinction between funding and financing. I never quite heard it made like that. One would have thought that they were synonymous. Yeah. But, let me ask you, looking at what it is that Nigeria has committed to, where we currently at, what would you say that is the funding gap, or shall I say the financing gap between where we are and where we'd like to be?
A recent, pre-COVID UN estimate that Nigeria needs approximately $85 billion to successfully implement the Sustainable Development Goals.
$85 billion?
Yeah. And so that was pre-COVID anyway. And with the COVID, you even can better imagine the challenges and the financing gap. So what the INF does is to make sure that outside the public sector, we mobilize resources both domestically and internationally to finance sustainable development. And to add to that, your distinction between funding and financing, largely funding comes from the public sector, while the financing comes from the broader economy. And once that is happening, it's more likely to be sustainable.
Okay, let me come to you, Ms. Belzer. How is the European Union? I mean, you've been doing amazing work supporting Nigeria on every angle, and you seem very interested in this as well. How is the EU supporting Nigeria in the INFF, with the INFF?
Thank you very much. Well, we have worked together with the government of Nigeria and with our colleagues of UNDP to support the INFF process all along the different phases. So the inception, the diagnostic, the design of the strategy. For instance, we have funded the development finance assessment that was mentioned by Mohamed. We have also funded the IMF technical mission that completed the costing of the SDGs. And this year we have added an additional funding of 1.7 million euros that is implemented through UNDP for the completion and the launch of the INFF strategy. This is a support at country level, but in fact, the European Union is supporting the INFF process since the beginning at global level. So we have also additional support available in Brussels for like a global technical assistance facility that is available to every country. You know, now there are 86 countries in the world that are engaged in an INFF process. Nigeria was a pioneer. Nigeria was in the first group of 16 countries, but now there are 86, more than 30 in Africa, and the European Union is engaged in most of these countries.
Why is this important to the European Union?
It is important because we believe that this is essential. It has been said this is essential to be able to finance the SDGs. I would add also the Paris Agreement, because we are talking about sustainable financing. And just after the COP27, we all know that this is also very important, that now the financing is sustainable to tackle climate change as well.
Well, Mr. Femi Edgar, I hope you're not feeling left out of the conversation. I know that where you come in will be this talk around financing. I don't know whether you identify with funding or you identify with financing. You tell us what it is you identify with. But drawing from the strategy, that's the INFF financing strategy, what do we hope to achieve with it, and what have we done? What have we done so far, especially in the area of tax, and what do we hope to achieve with it?
Once again, thank you for having us from the Federal Anonymous Service, and we're happy to continue to collaborate with our partners. When are you talking about funding or financing? As I talked, we in FRS know that this is coming to our table at the end of the day. You have to provide the resources to implement the SDG. What have we done? FRS has done a lot. I want us to reflect on the realities. In 2020, there was a lockdown, and the economy was in some difficulty. But in 2021, FRS met the highest collection targets in its history, over 6.4 trillion. The revenue that was brought in
2021.
The revenue that was brought in 2020 was 4.9. That's a 1.5 trillion added in spite of a lockdown. That's what we've done. There's room for us to do more, because the demands for public projects and programs that impact the lives of the common man are ever increasing. Today, in Nigeria, we also see that the reality is that every month, when the Federal Allocation Committee meets, and I'm sure my sister from Finance can confirm that FRS contributes the highest quota. So, though it's not enough, but FRS is meeting the financing or funding needs for government budgets at the federal, at the state and local governments, because what is shared in the FAC meetings is shared, distributed between federal, states and local governments. So FRS truly is bringing in the funds to impact the lives of Nigerians. And how have we done it? In the past 3 years, the chairman of FRS, the board, management and the staff have worked hard to ensure that we use strategies and technology to enhance revenue collection.
So it is interesting to me. I'll let you finish, on your thoughts on what you have been doing, because it's remarkable that, a year after COVID was when you were able to make one of the highest revenues you've ever brought to the federal government coffers. Yes. So it's interesting because Nigeria signed up before COVID to this program. I think we started recording gains maybe sometime in 2020. Is it as a result of the INFF or other things that the FRS was already planning to implement on its own before the INFF was even, brought into the picture?
Both the INFF and the board and management of FRS contributed to this. And the key issue was use technology more to drive tax administration end to end. The key thing in increasing revenues from tax is tied to compliance, taxpayer compliance. And what technology has been able to help us to do as we deployed it extensively end to end from the point of registration to payment of tax is that we made it easier for the taxpayer to comply by deploying technology and putting in place the use of data where there's no compliance. We can also compel compliance. That has helped in a very remarkable way to increase the quantum of revenue coming in from taxpayers.
Okay, so largely digitization for you has been key.
Yes, that's been very key, and that has been the area of focus, especially for the new board and management of FRS, and we can see the results.
In which areas would you say that you've had to deploy this digitization process? Where would you say, you know, it was grossly lacking and has made it really easy for taxpayers to comply?
You know, the whole gamut of tax administration starts from a taxpayer registering for tax to the point where you begin to file tax returns, then you make payments, then you want to use your withholding tax credit, you want to get a tax clearance certificate. All that has been a challenge over the years. But when you deploy technology, for example, a very novel technology called the Tax Pro Max, it's very robust. It enables the taxpayer, without even visiting the tax office, to do from your point of registration to payment of tax and even getting a tax clearance certificate. That has been very helpful. So the Tax Pro Max is a key initiative from FRS that enables taxpayers to have an easier ride in compliance.
We're about to take a moment now, but just before we do, because I know you'll be leaving us shortly, how will the UNDP continue to support Nigeria in achieving the development goals as we work towards the SDGs?
Well, we, together with the UN system, we were just finishing what we call a UN cooperation framework. In that, it's anchored to what Nigeria wants, because obviously we're here to support Nigeria's development ambition, and the SDGs provide that framework for us. So for UNDP specifically, we'll be focusing mainly on the issue of climate and climate change and how that impacts livelihood, and the EU also is a priority for them. And we'll also be focusing on issues around inclusivity, specifically it relates to inequality. Recently, the government launched the MPI, the multidimensional poverty, where for the first time we're able to tell where most extreme poor people live in Nigeria, and we want to target and support government to deal with that. And that is plan of President Buhari's plan to remove 100 million people out of poverty. And finally, the entire issue of governance. We support the elections, for example, the election, but also entire governance and peace building. We've seen a growth of insecurity, specifically in the northwest and the northeast, and we'll be continuing to support that. So overall, that's what we'll be doing. There are others who are doing a lot of work. You will hear from the EU and the World Bank and others who are supporting. But together as the international community, obviously, the SDG provides us that framework. And for Nigeria's development, I always say that Nigeria's development is not only a Nigerian problem, it's an African issue. If Nigeria meets the SDG, the continent meets the SDG. If Nigeria doesn't meet the SDG, the rest of us will all suffer as well.
Oh, that's significant. I mean, when you also consider how significant Nigeria's population is on the continent. Well, we'll be letting you go after this break. So I'm going to thank you, Mr. Mohamed Yahya, who is the resident representative of the United Nations Development Program. Well, we've been given a broad overview of a range of financing options available to Nigeria through the Integrated Financing Framework Strategy. We've been told that public finance is important, so also is private finance. But we'll be diving a bit deeper into these strategies when we return after the break. Please stay with us. Welcome back to this special program on the Integrated National Financing Framework, a set of tools meant to help Nigeria achieve its priority sustainable development goals by the year 2030. This program is brought to you by the European Union, the Office of the Senior Special Advisor to the President on SDGs, the UNDP in partnership with Channels Television, and we're right now about to take a deep dive into the financing strategy. But before we do so, a quick reminder that this program is also streaming on all our digital platforms, and your contributions are highly welcome through the social media handles showing on your screen. Well, I still have my distinguished group of panelists here. Yeah, that's the social media handles there, which they can follow. But let us look at, let me talk to my panelists who are right here in our studios. Let me come to you, Ms. Nabila Agwele. What are some of the biggest challenges in implementing the INFF in Nigeria when you look at it?
Sure. Thank you. So one that's already been discussed and that is part of the reason why the INFF is such a wonderful tool for us right now is this journey that we're on to continue diversifying our economy, to strengthen our revenue sources, and to think critically about how we better mobilize the private sector and establish that enabling environment. Of course, there's also challenges with infrastructure, so there's ongoing programs and initiatives around strengthening both hard and soft infrastructure, and we've heard our colleague from FRS talk about the ways in which they've better leveraged technology and how that's improved their revenue collection. There's also a lot of work being done around strengthening our institutions, both in terms of efficiency, in terms of that social contract between government and citizens through ongoing initiatives around accountability and transparency, such as the Open Government Partnership, of which we're a firm partner. There's also work around enhancing our governance and public financial management systems, so there's been quite a number of reforms in that respect. And of course, also continuing to build that enabling business environment. Okay, so let me look at I wanted to ask you about how we can resolve some of the challenges, because, I mean, as Mr. Edgar pointed out, one of the things that the FRS has done, it looks like it's something that was just waiting to be done all the time, which is digitization. Some of the challenges which you have, pointed out, how are we looking at resolving some of them? Are we already making headway with them? Absolutely, absolutely. So one that I'd like to talk specifically about is the work that's been done around improving the enabling business environment. One thing that all stakeholders agree on is that funding from development partners and even from government is meant to be catalytic in nature. When you think about the SDGs, I think a lot of focus is placed in respect to health and education, equality, but the SDGs, when you look at it, is really about development. So there's goals around infrastructure, around resilience in urban infrastructure, around business and access to business tools, and even around digitization. So in order for us to maximize both our national development in line with the SDGs and with other agreements, including the Paris Agreement and discussions around resiliency and around climate and climate finance, it's really important to catalyze and to really bring in the private sector. So the Presidential Enabling Business Council, PEBEC, as well as their secretariat, has over the course of their induction implemented, I would say, around 160 reforms targeted at improving the business environment. And one thing that we're working on now as a whole of government approach, and it's one of the core focus areas of the INFF, is to ensure that that work is deepened and that it now translates to increased domestic and international investor trust and buy-in, attracting more money and ensuring that the private sector is able to catalyze and do the work that they need to in the respective areas. Well, we've since been joined in this conversation by Mr. Shubham Chaudhry, who is the World Bank Country Director. You're welcome to the program. Thank you so much for being a part of the panelists. I quickly want to come to Dr. Yusuf Yunusa, who was talking about funding and financing, and has given us an overview of the gaps needed to finance what it is that we need to achieve if we're going to be on the path to development by the year 2030. I'm wondering, now that the National Bureau of Statistics has released these figures on poverty, and we're looking at how deeply pervasive the issue of poverty is, does it change perhaps maybe the issue of the gaps in terms of funding and financing? What does it really change for your office?
Okay, so for our office, let me also say it here. The office actually doesn't implement the Sustainable Development Goals. It is the ministries, department, and agencies at the national and at the subnational level that have the implementation capacity. But what we do at the office is to provide technical leadership in operationalizing the SDGs, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. So the challenge of poverty has always been with us. It is one of the cardinal objectives of President Buhari's administration in his second coming to lift 100 million Nigerians out of poverty during the decade of action for the global goals. And Nigeria has the largest social investment program on the continent. But whether that is reaching deeper, far enough, it is the issue that we all need to work together to make sure that with the, of course, this is the first multidimensional poverty result that we have. That means moving away from accounting only for income and consumption, but also looking at health, education, water, and sanitation. And all these things have been embedded in the framing of the Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 of them. It is about human capital development broadly. And so what we need to do now with this result is to make sure that we roll our sleeves and continue to work hard to ensure that we lift more people out of poverty. The COVID-19 has compounded even our challenges. More resources that would ordinarily go into other sectors of development had to be mobilized towards addressing the pandemic. But broadly, this is what it is. But then we encourage all stakeholders to put our heads together and ensure that we implement the SDGs the way it should be, mobilize the resources that are needed so that we can lift people or more people out of poverty within the remaining 8 years that we have.
Let me take this conversation to Lagos. I hope that my guests in Lagos are not feeling left out of the conversation. But I think that, you know, you're brought in for a specific purpose, which is to look at the issue of financing, especially when you're looking at the private areas of bringing in the private sector into the financing situation. So let me start with you, Mr. Bolaji Balogun, who is the co-chair of the PSAG. We're hoping that through the INFF, the private sector can galvanize the private sector to channel investments towards Nigeria's development agenda and priority SDGs. So what role would you say that the private sector has to play in the INFF?
I actually think that the INFF has been a remarkable wake-up call for a reality that, you know, many of us, you know, in financing markets have been aware of for a while. And that reality is that, you know, the government has very, very limited fiscal space. And the issues that have occurred, whether it's, you know, around our oil production in the Niger Delta or our burgeoning, you know, debt balance, basically mean that the government will have lesser fiscal space going forward. If you understand the nature of Nigeria's finances, and I was very interested, you know, listening to, you know, Mr. Edgar, you know, there earlier. If you put $100, you know, dollars through the government, 76 or 77 of those $100 go to debt service, or essentially the cost of government expenditure, which is, government's recurrent expenditure. Only about $23 to $24 out of 100 is available for capital expenditure. And when you strip down that capital expenditure, what you're going to understand is that the bulk of it is, again, largely financing government. It's fleets of cars, it's all of the paraphernalia of government. What's actually going through to development? And this is infrastructure, it's education, it's healthcare, is less than $6. So if you put money continually through the government, very, very little will get through to development. And therefore, it's really important to understand the really important and critical role that private capital will play over the next few years. And if you study the economic history of all of the nations that have significantly developed or industrialized since the end of the Second World War. There are some very, very common features. And one of them is the primacy and the importance of private capital and the role that private capital, and whether it's your domestic pension funds, it's your domestic asset management industry, it's international capital, including institutional and portfolio capital, it's philanthropic capital, right? It's family offices, retail investors, it's your diaspora capital. All of these segments of capital are far more significant. And it's really, really important, that in thinking about how we will finance all of the SDGs and lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in this country and across this continent, that we recognize the criticality of private capital and private partnerships.
I'll come to you again, representing Ministry of Finance. Thank you very much for your thoughts, Mr. Balogun. Indeed, nobody wants to know, I don't think anybody in the private sector will be happy knowing that of every $100 that we're spending, only 24 or thereabouts, $24 is actually going into capital expenditure, and even that, even just a small fraction is actually going to development. Is this something a government is aware of, and what are they doing to address it to ensure that we're able to attract more private financing, especially towards the SDGs?
Absolutely. So I think the honourable minister, as well as the director generals under her, has spoken extensively around the challenges of the fiscal economy, both on the revenue and expenditure side. As I said earlier, part of the challenge, the reality is that in all countries that industrialize, and what we're focusing on in Nigeria is using government funds as well as development funds to catalyze and to enable the private sector. So the idea is to really ensure that reforms through PEBEC and other organizations are aimed at ensuring that there's the right fiscal and regulatory environment, essentially to ensure that the private sector can come in and do what they need to do in the relevant sectors. So not only having domestic players come in, but also attracting more foreign players. Sorry? Oh.
By all means, I beg your pardon, I didn't catch the last line of what it was that you said, where you're saying something about catalyzing, doing some work to catalyze and make sure that, there is that flow of funds which we're looking at. I do know that within the financing strategy, we know that we're going to be depending heavily on domestic, public, and private financing, international public and private financing. Where is Nigeria leaning more towards?
Okay, so this is a good question. I wouldn't characterize it that way. I would say that on the domestic side, there are two buckets, right? There's the public and there's the private. And what the financing strategy says is that there's certain things that we need to be doing as a government, as development partners, et cetera, to unlock those financial resources. So when you look at the public finance side, FIRS has spoken to some of that. We're talking about efficiency in terms of how we collect revenue. We're talking about strengthening the social contract. We're talking about broadening the tax base and also deploying digital technology and resources, not just on the revenue side, but across government. On the private finance side, a lot has been said about remittances. So are we thinking very critically about how we tap into not just remittances from the diaspora community, but other investments, recognizing the strong diaspora context that we live in? Are we also looking to strengthen the regulatory environment so that our domestic banks and development banks are better able to function within the market and have the capital and lend and provide capital to business owners and the private sector in a way that makes sense? So I wouldn't say it's sort of a one versus the other. In each of the areas, there have been interventions that have been identified. Some are fiscal, some are regulatory, some are on the administrative side, some are policy. And if we sort of work towards implementing a mix of those, we will advance in the way that we want to. So it's not about choosing one or the other. It's about recognizing that there's work that needs to be done in all buckets. And of course, ensuring that the private sector has the right enabling environment is one of those critical buckets, because private funds are going to really be what allow us to achieve the SDGs.
And I think that's where Mr. Jude Onyeka Chiemeka comes in terms of private funds. I want to ask you, what are the challenges with leveraging institutional investors, and what can be done to strengthen contributions of local and institutional investors?
All right, thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the organizers of this program. And so if we move the conversation from funding to financing, it becomes very clear that markets will be the consideration. So the capital market essentially is where the bulk of the revenues or capital required for all this funding will be generated from. And if you look at the capital market where the NGX plays, we have done very well in terms of mobilizing the investor base through products that will be utilized to finance all these projects leading to the sustainable developmental goals. But from an institutional perspective, we do have an array of incentives, programs, capacity building to ensure that investors themselves understand these products and are able to contribute or invest in the products at the time of issuance. And so today you have the pension industry that have done significantly well in funding some of these projects that government have been funding through the issuance that DMO have been doing through the FGM bonds. But there's also the concept of international investors who typically will invest in the market. So as an exchange, we provide a platform that will enable the government to finance the projects by issuing instruments that these investors can invest in and ultimately also benefit from the investments. And that is why it becomes very critical in just laying out the investor base, ensuring that there's good governance and there's also sound investor education. And if you look at the recently revamped master plan for the capital markets, there's a conversation there that talks around increasing retail investor participation in our markets. And Mr. Bolaji Balogun talked about that as well as a core factor that will be also responsible for raising financing that is required for this project. Today, you have a market that has a universe of about 3 to 4 million investors, but active investor base is about 300,000. So the goal in the master plan is to revamp that to about 5 million between now and 2025. So it becomes very critical to ensure that from an NGX perspective, who will be responsible for building the platform, the investor base is very well structured in such a way that they understand the products that are being offered, and at the same time, they will be able to invest in those products so that the government can raise the capital needed. Let me just say that from the NGS perspective, we've been able to facilitate the raise of about 3.5 trillion naira since the beginning of the year for corporates, for governments, and at the same time even for state government. So it becomes easy if the conversation is understood from a financing perspective, that is the capital market that is going to be utilized in funding all these capital projects. And we are very well equipped to be able to do that because we do have the right platform and we have the right partnerships, leveraging our international partners. So there's a cross-border listings that are also involved. So it's not just domestic capital, but also the ability to attract international capital. Today we talk about the African Exchanges Linkage Project, which commenced on the 18th and will be launched in December. And that gives Nigeria the ability to also leverage other capital markets, in the investor base in all those capital markets, to be able to generate capital required for domestic funding and domestic capital requirements to fund all these lofty ideas of lifting our people from poverty. Thank you.
Okay, let me quickly come to you, Mr. Timo Glover. I do know that, you know, you work in terms of trying to mobilize the banks and, you know, getting them to lend to the causes that are also very important. We understand that only recently there was a report released showing that about 60% of the funds released by the banks given out in credit was to government. Banks continue to favor government and also the oil and gas sector for giving out loans. What do you think needs to be done to ensure that they also begin to consider those who are looking more at development and that credit to those sectors are also being mobilized?
Thank you very much. Maybe just to correct the space I work in the impact investing space, and we are very passionate about growing the impact investing sector, which the banking sector is one of them. I think we also have to think about the very important role that the bank plays in the economy as intermediaries, taking depositors' funds, you know, to the market. And if the bank is not able to carry out this role, there are some factors, there are some problems. You mentioned the fact that 60% of the funds that or credits to the economy goes to the government, which is an anomaly, shouldn't be. You're looking at how can banks lend more to the real sector? How can banks, you know, lend more to micro, small, and medium enterprises? And we all know that the MSME sector contributes quite significantly to the economy. In a recent report that the MBS produced this year and SMEDAN, there are about 39 million MSMEs providing 54 million jobs in Nigeria. And that's huge. And when we talk about unemployment at 33%, how do we structure financing for micro, small, and medium enterprises so that they can do more? If we have MSMEs employing about 3 people, you can see the effect that it will create in terms of creating jobs for the economy. Now, how do we increase the level of comfort that banks have to mobilize financing to MSMEs is the question I think you're asking there. Because banks being responsible for depositors' funds want to protect depositors' funds. They have to return those monies back to the depositors. And the MSME sector has some challenges. I would say largely they are informal. Of the 39 million, just a few of them are registered and will meet, you know, the stringent conditions that banks will require MSMEs to meet in order to access financing. Hence, the I think about 4% of banks or MSMEs have access to bank and finance, which is about 1.5 million going by the MBS report, which is low. So one of those things that we can do is how do we de-risk investment or share the risk with banks and come up with more of this kind of facilities to enable banks to lend to MSMEs. I would say that 2 things. It's not as if we don't know what to do. We know what to do, but how do we scale what has worked? I'll give you an example. The risk sharing facilities is one way in which we can share risk with banks and give them some level of comfort to finance with the SDGs, micro, small, medium enterprises. And I'll give you an example of the, I think the NISRA is called, the Nigerian Incentive Risk Sharing Agricultural Lending, which was established in 2013 with a share capital of about $500 million. It's quite interesting to see how they've been able to support financing to the agricultural sector. And now in 10 years, the banks are now more comfortable to lend to agricultural sector, increasing the total bank lending from 1.4% to about 7% in 10 years. That is whooping. What have we learned from NISRA and how can we scale this, replicate this in other sectors? The question, how can we create more of NISRAs in other sectors where we can even bring in MSME financing? And I think also Development Bank of Nigeria is not doing too badly. They created, I think, an Impact Credit Guarantee Limited to help provide some kind of guarantee and comfort to the MSME sector, to help banks to lend to MSME sectors. How has that impacted DBN? We've seen DBN disbursing in 5 years over 400, close to 500 million naira to 208 MSMEs. And that's impact. However, when we want to put this in perspective or in context, there are 39 million MSMEs in Nigeria. What's the percentage of that impact? About 0.005%. So how do we create more of this kind of guarantees to increase the level of comfort to banks, to give to the real sector, to fund MSME is a question we need to ask ourselves. We also need to be very bullish in terms of coming up with innovative financial instruments. I like this INFF we're talking about today. In my organization, the Nigerian Advisory Board for Impact Investing, which is part of work we do at IIF, we are facilitating a $1 billion wholesale impact investment fund. And part of that will go towards financing MSMEs because the banks themselves will not be able to do this. Even the government alone cannot do this. I'll mention about the MSME Development Fund that the federal government established in 2013. I would say it's a success to some extent, but I'll let you be the judge. I think it was the share capital was 220 billion naira, so 2013. Fast forward 8 years after, they've only been able to disburse about 38% of the fund, which is about 85 billion. For me, I was a little bit worried. We need to bring the right people to the room to see how we can mobilize massive funds to MSME. The bank is one important intermediary we must bring to the table. Also, we need the government to provide guarantees. We need, central bank is already doing very well, but there are buckets, working in buckets. But we need to come together to have the kind of impact we want to see in the MSME sector. Thank you.
We seem to be losing you towards the end of your interventions there. But largely, we caught a large part of what it is that you were saying about how we need to scale up because there are already examples of what is possible. But if you look at the examples that you've cited, quite a number of them look like special interventionist agencies. For instance, NERSL, it is a specialist bank for agriculture. DBN is looking at development as a whole. But I think that oftentimes when we talk about banks, I mean, I think what comes to mind are the deposit banks. And a lot of people will say that these banks are not particularly participating in the development sector. Is there any way that we can get the banks, the everyday banks that Nigerians know, to be an integral part of this, given towards, or will I say loaning towards this development sector?
I think it boils down to incentives. You have to find ways to incentivize the banks towards funding, SDGs. And you have to find a way to reward them. If there's no reward, I mean, reward makes you come back again to do a particular activity. How can we reward the bank or incentivize the banks to mobilize massive funding to the SDGs? So how do we get the CBN to do that? I would say that I think the CBN, through this MSME development fund I mentioned earlier on, are encouraging banks to, invest in the MSMEs or to give loans to MSMEs. So the same thing too, we have to bring to CBN here. I wish there was someone from CBN to speak to this. How do you incentivize banks to mobilize funds for SDGs? There's just one thing we have to do. How do we incentivize them? So incentive, incentive, incentive. I'll push that forward because we need to push banks, because at the end of the day, then in banking to make money is not a walk in the park, it's not concessional finance. They are people's money, they must return this money, they must make profit, they must pay salaries, they must cover costs. And there's also the cost of transactions, in structuring loans and financing SDGs. So how do they get the incentives that will lower this cost so that they can mobilize massive funds towards SDGs?
Thank you very much once again for your intervention. Let me come to you, Mr. Balogun. You've talked about some of the challenges standing in the way of the private sector wanting to get involved with, even giving more, or will I say financing the gap that we're seeing with the SDGs, and if it's going to be with government, if government is the lead driver, and we are seeing how the budget, spending on the budget is going, there'll be plenty of reluctance on the part of the private sector. One, I want to ask you, how are you having that conversation with government to see that more of the funds that we are budgeting for, especially if the private sector is now going to get more involved, not just through paying tax, but whatever other programs the government comes up with, that those funds are actually being targeted towards development?
Well, thanks very much, Markwe. I actually don't see challenges. I see more opportunities, and I do think that there are a number of ways in which, firstly, we can incentivize, but most importantly, we also need to be able to measure. And I think one of the simplest things that we can do as a country, and it's a conversation that certainly I've had with the finance ministry, is to ensure that when we are writing 2023's Finance Act, and on a going forward basis, it becomes essential for every company in Nigeria to report on what it does towards the SDGs. The moment that you make that an insertion in financial statements for all companies in Nigeria, I think you're going to find first and foremost that many, many more businesses in the private sector begin to think about the importance of the SDGs. And as people get involved, they will recognize that financing the SDGs is actually very, very good, not only for development, but for the longer-term sustainability and profitability of their own businesses as well.
We'll hear a lot of private sector people tell you about how they're already doing CSR with their corporate social responsibility count towards that.
Absolutely, and a lot of what people are doing in CSR, whether it's supporting education or it's supporting healthcare, is already a significant contribution towards the SDGs. But I think it's important, first and foremost, that it's measured properly and consistently, that it's transparent, that we can count it and we can measure it. And the moment that you begin to do that also, you see that there's a very, very significant imbalance. It's the same few companies who are doing a lot. It's not spread wide. So many of our member companies in the private sector advisory group, whether it's a Dangote Cement or it's a Lafarge Cement or a Unilever or a Sahara or an Oando or a PwC or a Chapel Hill Denham, these are an Access Bank. These are many of the companies that already take their SDGs very, very significantly. But what we now need to do is to mobilize a broader section of Nigeria's private sector, as well as Nigeria's philanthropic capital, to recognize the opportunity as well as the importance of funding the SDGs.
Let me ask you about PPPs. I mean, when Ms. Aguele was speaking, she talked about how at the end, at the bottom of this, it's not just about people out of poverty and, achieving a lot of the goals which have been stated, which is very important. But she says at the heart of it is development. And what we want to see, is infrastructure, is, good hospitals, etc. One of the ways that, people have said this can be achieved, getting the private sector very much involved, will be through public-private partnerships. We've experimented on a few of them, a few arrangements in Nigeria, some with some level of success. For you, what would you say is the biggest challenge standing in the way of public-private partnerships in Nigeria?
So I would start first and foremost by saying that, infrastructure is really at the foundation of anything that we do in terms of the SDGs. And it's quite interesting that there are 17 SDGs. For some reason, the one in the middle is the SDG about infrastructure. And there is no country that has developed rapidly without a sustained, very rapid investment into its infrastructure. And there's some very common features, again, that you find across all these countries. And I like to study what has happened ahead of us because I always think you can learn a lot. And one of the first things you find is that the participation of private sector and private capital is very, very fundamental. And if you look today at Nigeria's telecoms industry, it's an extremely good example of a sector where a regulator has entered and the government has played its role, which is to create an enabling environment, right? And by and large, it has stuck to that. And it's allowed people come in without controlling tariffs, you know, make the necessary investments. And we've gone from a nation of 540,000 telephone lines, which didn't work, to a nation now of 206 million mobile phones, and much more digital infrastructure across, you know, the base. Now compare that to our power industry, yeah? We have a regulatory environment where we think that it's important to control price, right? But controlling price when you don't have sufficient investments, you know, is a bit of a misnomer and is a bit of an oxymoron. What actually enables you control price in the long term, right, is you create the enabling environment, allow the investments to come in. When the investments come in and you have significant supply, competition is what then allows price be controlled. And I think we need as a nation, for example, to look at those two contrasts and say, how did we get it so right in telecoms? And how have we not done as well in power? And there's some incredible lessons to be learned. But ultimately, all of those sectors of infrastructure, whether it's physical infrastructure or it's social infrastructure like healthcare and education, are going to require very, very significant private capital interventions. And in many of those sectors today, it is possible for private capital to participate. The sectors where we've had the most difficulty are the sectors where there is significant overbearing government regulation, yeah? And we all need to look at the regulation. We all need to look at the way that we enforce the regulation, and we need to recognize, right, that capital, right, has many, many choices. If, for example, capital cannot enter our country and exit our country freely, it will never come here to invest in infrastructure, yeah? If, you know, you can build a big business here, and then having built the big business, the rules change at some point in the middle of the game, that capital will go to some other places. And we must recognize that if we're going to develop, whether it's domestic capital or it's foreign capital, it's looking for certainty, it's looking for predictability, because the investments you will make in infrastructure are about the long term. So private-public partnerships for me are purely about predictability, certainty, right, and a recognition that you have to create the playing ground that enables capital come and make those necessary investments. And when that happens, you create incredible results like we've had with Nigeria's digital infrastructure industry.
I do know that there are those who will take you up on your comparison of Nigeria's telecom sector with the power sector. They'll say, oh, you're comparing apples and oranges. And I wish we had more time to really delve into how you'd have loved to see us structure our power sector, because they say, oh, it's a monopoly. By the nature of its business, it's a monopoly. I wish we had that time. But I need to come to our Abuja studios. I know that you've been waiting for a while, Mr. Shubham Chaudhary. And I know that oftentimes when we mention the World Bank in Nigeria, there's always a bit of skepticism. But we cannot avoid the role that the World Bank plays in helping to secure international public finance. Can you tell us the role of not just your organization, but other international public finance institutions with the INFF?
So thank you. I hope we're beginning to overcome some of the skepticism you talked about, but I think it's, if you allow me, I'd like to begin by saying the role of the World Bank and many of the other multilateral development banks is really less about financing, or not just about financing, it's about the ultimate goal, which is, in the case of the World Bank, to help our 189 member countries eliminate poverty and make lives better for the bottom half, shared prosperity. So in that sense, the aims of an institution like the World Bank are very aligned with the SDGs, and then even more so with Nigeria's own aims of lifting 100 million Nigerians out of poverty. So we obviously bring concessional finance to the table, but that's not the only thing we bring. So let me go back to your question. INFF. INFF is basically a framework, a roadmap, if you like, putting together, drawing on the government's own plans of how can Nigeria obtain the financing it needs to achieve the SDGs. So the first part of it was just costing, getting a sense of dimensioning the problem, saying, look, for all the SDGs, given the gaps that are there, how much financing will it take? Then the next thing is to say, okay, if this is the volume of financing, recognizing that financing from public sources, or let's call it funding, is going to be limited, right? Whether it's the government's own ability to mobilize domestic revenues, or whether it's our ability as external partners to provide concessional financing. Ours is public in the sense that it is going to government and it's concessional. It's going to be limited relative to the size of what's required, the volume of financing that's required. And this was something, I forget exactly when, in 2015, there was an international conference building up to the SDGs, the title of which was From Billions to Trillions. This recognition that in order to achieve the development goals that the world aspired to, we could no longer be talking about billions of dollars, which is typically what public funds or concessional finance is about. It had to be about trillions, and that's exactly the point where you have to recognize that private firms are going to actually fill a lot of those financing needs. So let's take power. Okay, Nigeria has to meet the SDG on universal energy access, figure out a way to get electricity to about 90 million people. This is not something that government by itself is going to be able to fund, right? So you go to how can you crowd in private firms to invest, whether it's in solar mini grids, whether it's in power generation capacity, whether it's in distribution, but to do so from a profit motive. Right?
Okay, I'm going to let you speak a little more about the how Nigeria can leverage on international public financing when we come back from this break. Please stay with us.
Agro-processing industries account for almost half of total exports in developing countries, yet barely 30% of their agricultural produce undergoes industrial processing. Policies such as restricted forex access on certain imports are aimed at strengthening local manufacturing, but inadequate production is a challenge faced by many businesses in the Nigerian economy.
As at July last year, there was no corn at all in the country to sustain the poultry feed market, to the point the CBN had to give waiver for importing a small quantity to keep the industry going till the new season will arrive.
The Central Bank of Nigeria's Anchor Borrowers Program is supplemented with outgrower programs run by companies in conjunction with farmers to guarantee their supply chain. Nigeria is the largest producer of rice in Africa, but the sector is yet to unlock its full potential.
The return on investment depends on the season. During the dry season, this irrigation farming, the cost is a little bit higher. So the return will be like 20 to 30%. But during the rainy season, the return will be much more, like 40 to 50%.
Our market situation is quite favorable, but the problem is accessing funds to stockpile the raw material. We have 2 production lines. We have 1 line for vegetable oil. We also have another line which is fees. The demand on it is also much. We cannot meet all the market in the country, not talk of exporting.
As an incentive, 20% tax is granted for 5 years to agro-allied industries, which maintain a minimum of 70% local raw material sourcing and utilization. Business owners enjoy 0 import duty on importation of agricultural or agro-processing equipment.
The incentives we are getting is from FRS. They are giving 3 years tax exemption on VAT. We are increasing our capacity. We are producing 60 tons per day to 180 tons per day.
Additionally, the African Development Bank has mobilized $520 million for the establishment of special agro-industrial processing zones across various states in Nigeria. With a rapid urbanization rate of 4.2% annually, one thing is certain. The agro-processing sector holds the key to food security for Nigeria and closure of the commodity to consumption gap.
Welcome back. You're still on to our special program, which we are bringing to you from our studios here in Abuja and also in Lagos. We're talking about the Integrated National Financing Frameworks. This program is brought to you by the European Union, the Ministry of Finance. I have to apologize that I haven't mentioned them as a partner since. But yes, they are also great partners in on this program. The Office of the Senior Special Advisor to the President on the SDGs and the UNDP in partnership with Channels Television. And we're talking in the last beat now, taking recommendations on where we need to go from here. But just before we get there, we're going to our Lagos studio shortly to thank our guests there. We're talking about the how Nigeria can, and maybe not just Nigeria, for maybe other people that are watching from other countries, how they can leverage, but more particularly about Nigeria, how they can leverage on the financing that international public institutions can bring on board. Because we do know that certain reforms will have to be put in place, if I'm correct in that regard.
I think absolutely. Look, it's not just about the financing that we provide, but it's really how we can help. So I'm from the World Bank, but other institutions can help Nigeria leverage financing from the private sector. So I do want to emphasize, it's ultimately what can Nigeria do to attract private investment, say, in providing electricity. The World Bank, over the last 2.5 years, our board has committed $9 billion for government programs in Nigeria on basic health care, on keeping girls in school, on electricity access, but that's a drop. So I would, compared to what Nigeria needs in order to achieve the SDGs, so I think how we can help, certainly we can continue to provide financing, but if the government, if we can help work with government to have the policies and kind of regulatory environment to provide that certainty that we heard about earlier, where private firms will say, yes, we're willing to come, invest in Nigeria, whether it's a domestic firm or an international firm. And there, it's an issue of policy and regulatory certainty within certain industries, but also the broader cross-cutting macro certainty. Access to foreign exchange. If you invest, come in with dollars, are you going to be able to take it out? All of that kind of the basic macro fiscal environment is key as well. So that's what I would say is for Nigeria to achieve the SDGs, it needs to attract private investment at scale. And to do that, the policy and regulatory component, a kind of clarity and consistency are key. Exchange rates, power sector, every single area, providing that certainty is going to be key.
On this note, let me quickly go back to Lagos now and thank my guests in our Lagos studios, Mr. Bolaji Balogun. I know that you might have a closing word or two just before we go. Do you want to quickly say something, a last contributory word on the INFF and what you think that Nigeria really needs to do to leverage a private sector.
Thanks so much, Maokwe. I think it's really important that those words just spoken now by Mr. Chowdhury really resonate with everyone. Nigeria has a unique opportunity, and if you look around us and we have loads of young people getting on a plane every day and going somewhere else in the world, it's very, very simply because we're all not, creating an environment, that lets them realize that the opportunities they're going to look for in those places, will abound and they can prosper in this environment. And I think financing all of Nigeria's development needs over the next 30 years are very, very fundamental to that. But it requires great partnerships, and this indeed is the last SDG. It requires great collaboration between the government, the public sector, the private sector, by international actors. And I think it's really, really important when we think of all of the issues ahead of us, and in particular the energy transition, that we recognize as a country that on our own we have no ability to deliver a just or other energy transition without significant private capital or international interventions. As a result of that, when you know what the answer to something is, and what most wise people do is to work towards it. And working towards it is basically building on all of those elements that Mr. Chowdhury has just shared now. Thank you for inviting me to the program.
Thank you so much for honoring our invitation. Mr. Jude Onyeka Chiemeka, Divisional Head of the Capital Markets, NGX. I know you talked about 3.5 trillion, which you've been able to raise, not just for the public sector, but also for the private sector. I do not know if you want to give your closing words to the INFF on how it can further leverage on the abilities of the Nigerian stock exchange. Well, I don't want to say the Nigerian capital market to be able to meet its goals.
Thank you very much. I mean, the conversation is very interesting, but we need to move from talk to action. The capital market really is the bedrock for funding long-term developmental goals of any nation, and Nigeria is not an exception. So I think from a policy perspective, the government will need to pay more attention to the capital markets, ensure that all the right reforms are in place. Capital will always move to where they feel they will get the best returns and at the same time safety of the funds. And our market needs to be very investor conscious and friendly to be able to attract international capital. That is very key. Considering the fact that we do not have enough domestic capital to fund all these projects. So international partnerships, international funding continues to be a very good, viable means of mixing what we have in the domestic environment. But what is really key, to be honest, is the fact that the reforms and the policies required to develop and deepen the capital market will certainly be a critical focus for the government in order to actualize all the developmental goals that we're seeking to achieve. The capital market will continue to be very viable. At the NGX, we're committed to partnerships, both with domestic partners as well as international partners, to ensure that we continue to create the enabling environment that will allow products to be listed on our exchange, capacity building, both for the domestic retail investors as well as the domestic institutional investors to continue to play in the market with the right governance, ensuring that investor protection funds are in place to continue to encourage investment in the product. And if we're talking about the sustainable developmental goals, there's the climate element to it, and the market continues to be very aware of the climate change impact. And so today we're talking about green bonds, and the exchange has done incredibly well in helping to create the right consciousness, and we have been able to facilitate the raise of about $133 million just to address climate change-related matters. And these are some of the instruments that the exchange will continue to work on to ensure that we have the right instruments to attract private capital, and those capital will then be utilized in meeting all these developmental goals. Thank you very much for having us, and it's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Well, let me come to you, Mr. Temor. I don't want to say Etemor or Etemori Glover. And thank you for the space that you have been working, which is impact investment. So I would like your closing words on what you think needs to be done more to ensure that not just banks, but many more people are aware of impact investing and are brought into that sector.
Thank you very much, Mokbe. I'm really excited to be here and part of this discussion. I think discussions and platforms like this gives us the opportunity to talk about impact investing. I think when we started the conversation in 2019, the awareness wasn't there. You see people who wanted to shy away from impact investing, didn't want to be called impact investors, because the connotation was below market rate returns and or concessional funds. But impact investing brings in capital from across the capital continuum. I like what Bolaji mentioned. You look at from philanthropic sources, you look at from venture capital sources, you look at both impact investors, you look at those who are above market rate, seeking above market rate returns. All of these people need to come into the universe of impact investing to deploy funds with intentionality. The intentionality to address SDGs, to move funds massively towards, providing financing. I like the word financing, brings in the sustainability, for investing to achieve the SDGs, as well as financial returns. That reward must be there, so there's no sacrifice in returns. You get your financial returns, as well as you get your impact. And that is the sustainability we're trying to drive in the impact investing space. It's a whole universe that we need to speak to policymakers. We need the right policies to create the market infrastructure. Is a new space. We need policy to recognize impact investing as an investment strategy that cuts across all asset classes. We also need incentives I mentioned earlier on to bring in more private sector participation into the impact investing space. There are opportunities for the growth of impact investing. We've seen it grow quite significantly from 2005 to 2019. However, we need to do more. I mean, if you compare the West African region, Nigeria and Ghana are the two largest markets. But if you compare the region of West Africa to Kenya, Kenya is attracting more impact capital than West Africa. What can we do to create the right environment to attract more impact investment is what we need to discuss on the table. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. On this note, I have to thank my panelists who have joined us from our Lagos studios and the audience there as well, because I see that we had a number of people in the audience in Lagos. Bolaji Balogun, who's the co-chair of the PSAG, that's a private sector advisory group. Jude Onyeka Chiemeka, divisional head, capital markets, NGX. Temori Glover, who is the project lead, Impact Investment Foundation. Thank you so much for being a part of this dialogue.
Thank you.
Well, let's come back to our Abuja studios now. We're still having the conversation, but we're looking ahead. Let me ask you from the EU whether you share. Are you optimistic that given where we are, not just the conversations we're having on the INFF, but what you know about, because you've praised Nigeria now, that we've been one of the first to sign up to this, and that's very exciting to know, one of the very first to be able to, get together this integrated national financing framework. Are you confident, looking forward, that Nigeria will be able to not just make the well, I say make the monies, because at the end of the day, it's money we're talking about, right? Are you sure that we'll be able to, meet the financing needs you know, towards achieving the SDGs, given what we currently have on the ground?
Well, this is our common objective, I would say, all together, so the development partners, the financial institutions, the government and the private sector, as we have heard a lot, because the INFF strategy is not an end in itself. It identifies solutions to the different challenges. So it calls for further collaboration. So of course we all believe that we can do it together. Otherwise we wouldn't do this job that I'm doing. But we know we have a lot of work together ahead, and we need to work on it together.
Are you happy with the enthusiasm that you're seeing on the ground?
I think, yeah, I think really now again, the INFF strategy identifies solutions, and so we have to work on them together. For instance, as far as the European Union is concerned, we want to work on the implementation of these solutions with our development cooperation program, multi-annual program. We have different priorities which I think echo very well what we have said today. I can give you one example. Under our green economy priority area, we really want to work to contribute to mobilize financial flows from the private sector in sustainable investments in agribusiness, in renewable energy, in circular economy. So this is, I think it's really in line with what we have discussed today. In doing so, even more, we are working with the European Union member states, which are present in Nigeria, so in what we call a Team Europe approach. And on green economy, we have already started. And we have, in a collective effort, we have put together all our projects in green economy, and we have prepared what we call this Team Europe initiative, which is 1.3 billion euros. So it shows that we are all collectively, mobilized to reach better, sustainable, high quality investments that also, so not only that are sustainable, but also that do not forget the human capital, the human development dimension.
I understand completely. So let me ask you, Dr. Yusuf Yunusa, I asked her about optimism, and I'm going to ask you that very carefully, because I know that, much as you're working as a technical partner, you know that we're working within a political space. One, are you optimistic? This is a great thing that we have this started and we are underway. But do you fear that we could suffer some distractions along the way?
Oh, thank you so much, Mark. I think we have to be optimistic. In the design of the Integrated National Financing Framework, we have the National Steering Committee, and it's a multi-stakeholder, and it's led by the Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning. And we have membership from the IMF, World Bank, EU, UNDP, and the Resident Coordinator's Office of the United. So that is at that level. We have also the co-working group, which is also a multi-stakeholder co-working group. So what we have just finished actually is the design phase of the INFF. The report was launched on the margins of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 24th, 2020 by His Excellency, the President of the Federal Republic. So what we will now do is to move into the implementation phase, and we must be optimistic that the key recommendations outlined in the strategy needs to be implemented by both the state and non-state actors, and ensure that we mobilize the needed resources that are necessary to support the effective implementation of the SDGs, as we have barely 7.5 years to go.
So let me ask you, Mr. Gwele, what exactly is the next plan of action? We have put this together. It's been a success. We have received plenty of praise for it, being at the forefront of it. But what's next?
Thank you. So what's next is really implementation, and I can't stress that enough. The INFF identifies where we need to go, what the potential opportunities are, and pretty much most of the stakeholders that are part of this conversation are members that contributed to the development of that INFF. For example, we've heard extensively from colleagues from the private sector, including Mr. Balogun. Mr. Balogun is a member of the INFF group of people that have come together to develop this. So implementation is critical, integrated implementation that is targeted and focused, and that recognizes that this notion of a multi-stakeholder approach where everyone has a seat at the table, including the state government. So one thing that hasn't come up is that as part of the INFF development process, we had a robust stakeholder engagement, and one of the best sessions was a session we had where all states were represented, both by their commissioners of finance as well as of budget and planning, and also by the focal persons in the offices of the governor that focus on the SDGs. And so this has been developed both from a top-down approach, but also from a state-level perspective, because that implementation that we're talking about has to happen at the state level. So the next stage is implementation, ensuring that those stakeholders that are at the table focus on the areas that are keyed into their specific areas of focus and intervention already, and a continued focus and optimism. I agree that we have no choice but to be optimistic. I think those of us who've worked together to do this are optimistic because we've seen the power of coming together with everyone at the table, but also this is a critical time for Nigeria and for the world generally. So a lot has been said about the need to not to move away from business as usual and to bring everyone to the table and focus on implementing. And what's also unique about the INFF is that we haven't discussed this. There's a monitoring and reporting framework embedded into the INFF. So you have multiple stakeholders, both domestic partners, private sector, government, etc., including agencies and entities we've not yet discussed. CBN is a member, Budget Office, FIRS, of course, capital markets were extensively consulted in this. So the idea is to implement, but to be really bold and to be ambitious and to recognize that time is not in our favor. So we need to move quickly.
So thank you for that. And it's interesting you say that implementation is the next step. What would implementation mean for the World Bank?
For us, it would mean coming in behind the government's efforts and through government, the broader group of stakeholders, to address what we see as embedded in the INFF, but with a very clear kind of vision of how do we help Nigeria mobilize the financing it needs to meet the SDGs. And there's some pretty obvious kind of first 3 or 4 steps that are choices for Nigeria to make, and choices that I hope will be made in the context of the upcoming transition, choices about the policies at the macro level, about exchange rates. It's all about crowding in private investment. So that's one. Second, choices about where to redirect, where to use the resources that the government does have. Should it go towards building more schools, junior secondary schools, so more adolescent girls can stay in school, or should it go towards PMS subsidies? Choices such as those. Third, how can government kind of mobilize more revenues? We heard from FIRS about all that it has done on the non-oil front. I think but that will require really rebuilding the trust between the state and citizens on, look, by paying taxes, by contributing to the fiscal resources of government, you're contributing to the future of Nigeria, but also gives citizens a stake in holding government accountable. Okay, and I think that's a third big step. And finally, in all of this, I think the continuous monitoring that Ms. Aguele mentioned, to make sure that there is that accountability, that feedback mechanism, right? So that both private firms as well as ordinary citizens can have a sense of, look, what is government doing to help this implementation process?
Indeed, thank you so much for your contribution there. I'm going to be going to our audience members. I do know that a few of us do want to, or let me say a number of us want to contribute to this discussion. May I call on Dr. Chukwuka Onyekwena, who is Executive Director, Center for the Study of the Economics or Economics. Is it Economies or Economics? Economics of Africa. Economies of Africa. Economies of Africa. Great, please, by all means, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I actually have a specific question for Nabila. Given the huge need and urgency for improving domestic resource mobilization and the considerable progress in the use of technology in improving tax collection, can you unpack what this technology is? What sort of technology is it? What sectors have been successful? And what states have we seen any form of improvement? And how can it be scaled up, in terms of implementing the INFF? Thank you.
Great question, and I actually wish my colleague from FIRS was here to sort of supplement my answer. I think he touched on during his comments that there's a new technology that FIRS has deployed, and the idea is it's being deployed both at the federal and the state level. And the idea is to really improve efficiency in revenue collection. So in instances you would have things being done manually, you have inefficiencies, you have opportunities for inconsistencies in application, things are digitized, you're able to track people, you're able to get a sense of who's being compliant, and also get a sense of where those revenue flows are going. There's also work being done around tax ID numbers, and then also this notion of national identity and making sure that you can better capture people who aren't necessarily easily identified. So I know there's a lot of reform work being done in terms of saying, what do we need to do to ensure that everyone has a type of ID number, whether it's their TIN or their NIN, that can be used, and how can that be then considered in terms of enhancing the ways in which we use digitization. I would encourage you and others to visit the FIRS website. I believe they have a section where they talk about the steps that they're taking and their continued focus on digitization. And the digitization efforts in the revenue mobilization perspective are part of a broader government approach towards digitization. So for example, outside of revenues, even in the customs environment, there's been a lot of focus on using digital tools to ensure efficiency in processes that are otherwise taking longer and are less efficient and more costly as a result.
Thanks, Nabila.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ihenechukwu Namani, is that you?
That's me.
Okay, that's him, okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So the question, I'll be asking Doctor and yourself the question, and this has to do with the impact financing that you guys talked about from the Lagos studio as well. When it comes to international sister city kind of private international financing that we see a lot of developed countries deploying, for example, having a particular sister city in a country partner with another sister city, for example, in Africa, and using that way to connect with their Chamber of Commerce to actually push financing. Is this something that has been put into consideration in the INFF, in the framework that you guys are talking about? And then when it comes to actually what the doctor mentioned about the framework moving from the national, state, and down to local government level, how do you guys plan to target? Like you mentioned monitoring, but is there any idea on how the local government level is monitored? Because I heard you mention working with the Commissioner of Finance in every state, but how will it get down to the local government level where we think that the main impact should actually come from that aspect?
Okay, thank you so much. Let me answer that part. So the INFF report actually looked at the fiscal federalism, where you look at the national, the 36 states, and the local governments. And we looked at the responsibilities of each tier of government. And we know that we need to strengthen our fiscal capacity, for the local governments to generate internally, as well as the states to generate internally generated revenues that will go into financing development. So it's clear there, and what we must do between now and when we begin the implementation to mobilize as part of the broader strategy of mobilizing domestic resources for achieving that. And then INFF has also recognized the new variants of financing development, and that it's where you have the impact investment. It's a new concept, and we know that it's been operating very well in Africa and even in Nigeria, but we need to scale up the impact investment opportunities that will help us as, if you like, innovative financing mechanisms that will support our domestic private resource mobilization strategy. And Etemore mentioned the wholesale impact investment fund, and we're also part of that, which we need to mobilize this broader initiative to mobilize smaller impact investment opportunities into a wholesale framework for financing development. So the INFF report and the framework has recognized this. And the monitoring and evaluation framework is also embedded in the plan. And like Nabila mentioned, we need to do that both at the national and at the subnational level. And it's part of the mandate of the Office of the Senior Special Assistant to the President on SDGs to do monitoring, evaluation, and reporting for the SDGs. But then the Ministry of Finance, Budget, and National Planning also has a directorate of national monitoring and evaluation. And therefore, within these two contexts, we will be able to effectively track the implementation.
So quick, you wanted to add something to it?
Yes, I think on the sister city comment.
Yes, so I think your sister city question is really important because it speaks to this notion of collaboration and coordination between cities within a country, between countries within a region, and across regions. And this is something that the INFF definitely anticipates, and it's something that this government has been thinking very critically about. Of course, it's come up a lot in the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. We've also been observing the activities of an entity called the Arab Africa Trade Bridges Group, which is looking at trade across Africa and the Arab region. There's also a lot of emphasis on enhanced interaction and coordination between the global south and the global north. So these are things that are critical to our success. And part of when we think about digitization, when we think about collaboration, when we think about leveraging the expertise of the development partners, for example, Mr. Chowdhury has emphasized that when we partner with these organizations, we aren't just receiving funding, but we're also receiving best practices, understanding of initiatives that they've put into place in other countries. So these are things that are naturally embedded in both the INFF and in the way that government has been looking at these interventions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Yakin Abdul Malik. Yes, please.
Let me thank the organizers of this event for the opportunity given me to be here in the first place and then to interact with this. I think this is the people who matter for development in the world, so to say. When I was in secondary school, we used to be told that foreign banks don't use to lend to domestic economy. So I was worried and I was praying that I'll be in the banking industry and I'll be lending to Nigerians. I worked in the banking industry and I regretted lending to a lot of organizations. Yeah. So the point I'm trying to make is that if we are still here talking about bank not lending enough, especially deposit money banks, maybe there's something that is not quite correct in that notion. And that has been summarized by Mr. Quadri and Balogu from this thing. There's a continuous tendency for government to crowd out the private sector. It is simply summarized in theory. The federal government seems to be doing too much more in the private sector than it should do. And it has already been said that the government should be talking about policies and principles, rules that guide the private sector in doing what they should do. I think we should look at it that way. Two, there's also this issue of what we try to describe as a unique species hypothesis, where some of us think that certain things that work somewhere else, theories that work somewhere else, don't work in Nigeria. And as a result of that, we'll take a concept, we beat it, then we say this is Nigeria. And at the end of the day, it doesn't work. We are talking about capital flow. capital is not flowing enough, especially FDI is not flowing enough into Nigeria. That has been researched enough for a very long time. That's also summarized in simple. The Lucas paradox says so. Capital goes to where capital is well respected. It's as simple as that. So the point I'm trying to make is that if the government, for us to achieve the INFF policy, I think the government will have to look at things more from the theoretical aspect than agree or decide that they are not going to anchor most of their thoughts around policies. Then the practice, for example.
I'm afraid that we're totally out of time.
Okay.
We really have to go now.
Except that you didn't give me the time. You didn't tell me how many minutes.
Apologies for that.
Okay,
thank you so much for your contributions, Dr. Abdul Malik. I wish you could take yours, but we're totally out of time.
Okay.
On this note, I'll have to thank my panelists who have graciously graced our conversation today. Ms. Nabila Agoile, who's Special Advisor to the Honorable Minister, the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning. Thank you so much for coming on. Beg your pardon now, Dr. Bala Yusuf Yunusa, who is the Senior Technical Advisor, Office of the Senior Special Advisor to the President on SDGs. Thank you so much for coming on. Ms. Cecil Tassin-Pelza of the European Union, thank you so much for coming on as well. And Mr. Shubham Chaudhary, World Bank Country Director, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us this beautiful afternoon. Well, we've come to the end of this dialogue for today, but you will agree that this certainly needs to be an ongoing discussion as Nigeria works towards the sustainable development goals, especially those that she has prioritized. We have to thank our partners, the European Union, the Ministry of Finance, the Office of the Senior Special Advisor to the President on SDG, and the UNDP for making this conversation possible. Thank you to the special audience here and also to our audience in Lagos, to those on Zoom, those who joined us via Zoom. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation, and to you at home for being, or wherever it is that you are, where you watch this conversation. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Thank you for watching. I'm Maokwe Ogun Yusuf. Goodbye.